listen, I was an English major. I'm in love with words. Like economy of words is nothing that I was used to. And then you become a journalist, you realize the economy of words is really important.
Dave Bolger here, and welcome to Had I Known, a show that explores the journeys of some of the most interesting members of the Hamilton College community. This week's guest is Edvige Jean-François, class of 1990. All right. Hello again. A few weeks ago, I asked for feedback. I asked for you to reach out and tell me what you think of the show and make some suggestions, and some of you responded. So thank you to that. I've been getting some really great recommendations on who to talk to. The list of interesting members of the Hamilton community is very long, and I'm learning that it's getting longer and longer, which is great. Also heard from folks who enjoyed last week's show with Michael Tennant. There was a brief mention in that episode about the essay Michael wrote for the special edition of the Hamilton magazine entitled We Are Hamilton. We didn't talk much about that magazine because this week we're going to talk a lot about that magazine. Edvige Jean-François was the guest editor of that magazine, and she's our guest this week. She's an award-winning journalist and producer and has played a key role in large organizations including CNN, CNN International, and the Associated Press. She's covered news all over the world, and she was a driving force behind the creation of that alumni magazine you got in the mail that was unlike any other issue you've ever gotten. And as you'll hear, we talk a lot about what went into the creation of that magazine, how Edvige came to the project, and what it's all meant for the Hamilton community. If you want to hear more about her career, I encourage you to check out her appearance on Paid by the Word, fellow Hamilton grad and former guest of this show, Mike Barlow's podcast. There'll be a link to it in the show notes. Edvige and Mike have a really great conversation on that show about her career and really journalism at large. So go ahead and check that out if you want to hear more. But before you do that, check this one out. Here is a great conversation with Edvige Jean-François, class of 1990.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for doing this.
Of course, of course. I'm always happy to talk to someone in the Hamily. Especially of late, I feel like I've been talking to so many in the Hamily.
I'll bet. It seems like there's been quite a lot of attention, rightfully so, on you and the work you did with the magazine. So, and I saw a lot of talks and things that have followed. So, yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, it has been great. It's been it's been quite a journey. Although, as a journalist, I take issue that the focus has been on me because we always make it about the folks we talk to. But obviously, it's been a great collaboration. Really, just thinking to getting to this moment where you sort of graduate, you move on, you dip your toe back in every now and then comes an opportunity to actually widen the circle of friends and colleagues. So it's what it's been like since I guest edited the issue of the alumni magazine. So
yeah, one of the things that was interesting to me, both in some of our initial correspondence and in fact, you write about it in your opening letter in the magazine, is how you dug back into your Hamilton past and reconnected. And what's interesting is that's very much a similar experience I had in doing this show and feedback I've gotten from alums who listen. And it's interesting certainly with hindsight being what it is, looking back at your Hamilton experience with more adult eyes. I'm curious what you learned about yourself or learned about your Hamilton experience that you hadn't remembered or considered differently.
It's really interesting because going back through my Hamilton archives, and I'm a terrible pack rat. I mean, actually was just a bit ashamed as to some of the things I found, like papers and blue books and
Wow.
memorabilia. I found a poster from when Maya Angelou came to the campus and she signed it. I found one from Angela Davis that was
Wow.
signed. So
Wow.
really just sort of like a Hamilton scrapbook I didn't even know I had. I never did find my yearbook,
Huh.
but I imagine eventually it will surface. But it was sort of interesting, your young mind and then your adult mind.
Yeah.
And I took myself back to when I first got to campus. I visited campus during Multicultural Weekend. I'd gotten one of those invitations in the mail out of the blue to come visit Hamilton. And I did. I remember thinking the campus was beautiful. I had such an incredible time. There were lots of students of color, and I literally went back home and I was like, "Oh my God, this is it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't need to visit anywhere else."
And
And
where was home?
Spring Valley, New York, Rockland County,
Okay.
Rockland County, New York, and it's I visited, and it was the immediate choice. And I just felt like this was the college for me, and I ended up applying. I got in, and when I went through, there's a summer program for some incoming students. I was part of that, and I remember when I got to the campus, I was surprised in terms of the numbers that I saw during Multicultural Weekend and the actual numbers of people of color who actually matriculated.
Right.
There's a wide difference. And
Sure.
so I think Hamilton did a great job with the PR in terms of introducing me to the college and that experience, which fueled why I ended up going to Hamilton.
Did
So
that sour you when you realized what it was really like on campus? Did that sour your experience at all?
it was surprising. I
Mm.
mean, it's because I think, you're 18, you completely sort of fall in love with an experience. And you mentioned your young mind, in my young mind, I didn't necessarily put two and two together that this was a predominantly white college and that some of the students you see are not going to be here when you get here.
Mm.
I don't think, at least for me, I understood all the intricacies of it. I understood the spirit of definitely wanting to open the door wider to students, but I think for me, I didn't understand what that meant.
Got it.
And Clinton itself, the Hill itself, is it's
Even whiter.
isolating. So so it was sort of going through all of that at the same time. So so that was sort of part of going through the narrative of what led me to go to Hamilton, which of course I've never regretted that decision.
And then as you were digging through the time capsule that you opened up, what other memories came back or experiences that have you recalled? I mean, the Angela Davis, Maya Angelou finds. I mean, those are collector's items. That's
Absolutely. And I remembered meeting both of them. I did not realize that I had, particularly in the case of Angela Davis, that I actually had a poster that she signed with Maya Angelou. I was lucky enough not only to first meet her at Hamilton, but to later, as a journalist, be at her house to produce an interview. So it was sort of like this surreal feeling of being in her home. And after the interview, it was just the two of us, got the chance to sit down at her kitchen table to go through some of her cookbooks. She talked about her recipes. She had a sunroom that was almost like a trophy room that looked out to this beautiful garden. So there I was holding hands with Maya Angelou, and like seriously. And so it was great to kind of relive that experience when I found the posters. And I do think one of the things that Hamilton, the time I was there, while certainly the school did not have a lot of people of color, I found that the speakers were very diverse. I remember Nikki Giovanni coming there. There were tons of speakers of color, prominent African Americans, prominent people from the Black diaspora, Latin America, that came to the campus to speak. So while the exposure wasn't there in terms of the numbers or even parts of the course curriculum that I found could have been more amplified with course of study that reflected people of color to a broader extent. In fact, I was part of an organization, I forgot what they called it, the social organization that was tasked with bringing speakers to the campus. So obviously part of my job was to make sure that they were diverse speakers. But I did find that that ability to have these intellectuals on campus was something that was very, very gratifying.
And as you started to reconnect with your Hamilton experience in preparation for helping to put together the magazine, and connecting, I imagine, with the current iteration of the school in a new way, how do you view the current school versus your experience, and how hopefully in ways it's gotten better for people of color? What was your experience putting that together?
Well, one of the things that, and I'll speak for myself, and it may be the case for other students of color. I think, to be honest, I think the first part of graduating from Hamilton, and I think I alluded to that, or maybe spoke very openly about it to an extent in my letter, my guest editor letter, where I talked about the people who embraced me, and also those who I think I said sought to diminish me. So I think I spoke to it without necessarily wanting to get into the weeds of it. And I don't think what I said was probably not surprising to many people. And I think for me, what I understood was because I had been brought up in a home that was very much sort of strengthened who I was going to be in the world, what I had to offer to the world. When those occasions came to the fore, they were painful, they were hurtful, they were shocking, but I think I had the intestinal fortitude to deal with it. And I also felt that there was a community of friends and colleagues and professors, and particularly Christine Johnson, Miss J, who I remember one incident in particular, I went and I told her about it. And without getting into the specifics, and when I went to her, this was something that had been happening in one of my classes. And so it's sort of a thing, it happened once, it happened twice, it happened the third time, then you realize it's a real thing. And I remember I went to her to say, hey, this is happening. I don't know what it means, but I don't think it should be happening. This was my first year. And someone in the classroom had beaten me to the punch. One of the white students had actually gone to her and was bothered by what had happened. Just as I was getting there to tell her, someone else also felt uncomfortable by it. So to sort of jump ahead to where we are in 2021, when people talk about allyship, I'm sure that student, neither did I, right, had any notion of what allyship is. So this is what we call it now.
Sure.
But it's as basic as you see something, you say something.
Right.
So there were those moments, but overwhelmingly, it's also, I'm a college student. I had tons of fun, all the sort of craziness of being at a college and being young and being nuts and doing, the crazy things that we all do.
Yeah.
I did them as well. And circling some of that experience, not all the time, not wholly, not constantly, were incidents of racism, as I mentioned, that were injurious. But I also had many white students who I was very friendly with. And I think part of what it was at the time in putting together the magazine and realizing that some of those hurts continue to happen. But I can't say that it's exactly the same from what I understand, what I've come to know in these past weeks and months, the numbers have improved and there's more social engagement. There's the ability for students to go on social media and be a lot more vocal about it. And I know in my time, at the time I was there, was the apartheid movement was huge. And, I was very much part of that, protesting on campus, being very vocal. And so for me, actually, part of that engagement, and I also had a show on WHCL, a music show. I was a news reader and did journalism there and wrote for The Spectator. So I think part of it in an interesting way sort of led to my interest in journalism. And so for me to be able to put the magazine together, it was my reflection about my time there, the time we are in now, and also the ability to really talk about these issues of racial inequality, not as an outside observer, but as someone who has gone through it, as a citizen, as a student, and now getting to, as a journalist, having the benefit of giving my opinion, to say what I feel and shaping this magazine. As you know, Dave, you've spoken to a number of journalists on your show, and I'm glad that you like us journalists. So, I'm sure you've heard that we're supposed to be out of it, right? We're not part of the story. We're supposed to be disengaged and neutral. But obviously, this was a piece where I got to talk about what I thought, what I felt about some of the things that are going on.
Right. How did you come to this project?
Well, interestingly enough, last year in July, in fact, the editors of Hamilton Magazine had reached out to me. They were putting a piece about COVID-19 called "A World Forever Changed." Basically reflections from different alums about how they think COVID would change their industry. And mine was talking about journalism, how I imagine journalism would be post COVID-19. And, I talked about how, for me, I don't know if you ever watched an episode of The Walking Dead where people go out on runs. You got to get geared up. And that's what life was like. You put on your mask, your gloves, and off you go. So I talked about how it required a battle plan just to leave the front door. And then I sort of talked about how the reckoning, the upheaval, the hurt, the pain that ensued from the George Floyd murder had begun a reckoning in the country. And I mentioned that in journalism as well, even while we are the folks covering the stories, that we needed to sort of look at diversifying our ranks, because in having those diverse voices, you can sort of have a broader view of the narrative. Now, I will tell you, most Black journalists I know don't necessarily want to be only covering issues of pertaining to people of color. And we don't. We're very nimble. We can do whatever. But at the same time, that there needed to be particular attention to it and what it meant, and some of the challenges we were having in terms of the First Amendment, people beating up on journalists and whatnot. Yeah. And so I think because it was a sort of like a fresh association, that when the editors were thinking of Stacy Himmelberger in particular as the editor of the magazine, was thinking of putting the issue together, that initially I think their thinking was it was going to be an article, and then they decided to sort of dedicate it entire issue. They reached out to me. So there had been that fresh association from a couple months prior. And before that, I had written for Hamilton about my experience as a Haitian American journalist covering Haiti. And before that, I was part of the Bicentennial Project. I was a mentor, a student mentor, working to help students who were writing about reflecting back on Hamilton, 200 years later. So there had been a relationship in that way. And so they thought of me, and I said yes.
And it worked out beautifully, clearly. As you were putting the issue together and collecting these powerful voices, was there anything that surprised you in what you gathered from these folks, or what you read from these folks as they were putting this together?
So my first approach, and I think this is how it helped, at least to me being a journalist, because my first approach was to first want to know as much as I needed to know. And so I approached it really from a fact-finding perspective. So first off, what are the stories that are relevant and need to be told? And initially, they weren't necessarily stories, but they were more topics, right? It was pretty obvious. George Floyd, we needed to address that. The surrounding issues around that were inequality, healthcare mostly we talked about, but also some of the economic inequality that needed to be addressed. I mentioned Clara Christine Johnson before. I felt like she was just this incredible, powerful figure that was so important to the college community, not just to Black students, to all students, because her program, had white students as well over the years. So I felt like we needed that voice. I didn't know what the approach was going to be, but immediately, if there were two stories that I knew immediately that I wanted to do, was George Floyd, and it was one on Miss J. And then the rest of it was sort of, the Black woman, the role, particularly, in the spirit of the election of Vice President Kamala Harris, and Stacey Abrams has become quite a powerful political figure. So I felt that needed to be part of the narrative. So I was kind of going through the buckets, policing and so on, made a list. And some cases we had to drop some of the topics that we wanted to cover because they were being written by alums. And in some cases, people didn't have the time, or other people felt they didn't have the expertise to talk about a particular issue. So that was the first part. And the second part was to find the people who wanted to address the topics. And then my role as editor, knowing, as a journalist, I'm used to writing, putting stories together. But if you, for example, Dave, have a powerful story and it's in your heart, it's in your spirit, you may not necessarily feel like you have all the tools to sit down and write a 2,000-page essay. That certainly doesn't disqualify you. So it's about working with people who may want to tell the story and have a powerful story, and then sort of working through the mechanics. Having said that, we're all Hamilton graduates. We're all beat over the head about.
We're all good, right? Yeah, right. We're writers.
So it would have been highly shocking to find any one of the essay contributors who couldn't deliver, a draft that just needed a little bit of massaging rather than off to the dustbin,
Well, that was one of the things I think as a reader that made it so highly engaging. Obviously the powerful stories and the powerful voices but the format of each story had some differences in it, which made it different and engaging and easy to read, and which makes for a good magazine, which means the editor did a good job. So back to you, they made the right choice.
Thank you. I will take my laurels. But it's and also a part of it was figuring out you wanted to be informative, you wanted to be engaging, you wanted to also be an experience that people will read it and engage to it as something that's revealing and also enjoyable. Now, I use the word enjoyable in its meaning, right? Because how can it be enjoyable that you're reading about stories of inequality and injustice, but enjoyable in the sense that you are consuming something that makes you want to read more. And so that was important as well. And I think for me, what was particularly interesting that my audience was an audience that all of us, which it was important for me to indicate, we all share Hamilton College as a seminal formative experience.
Right.
So I felt that in and of itself, while there may be people who don't agree with the content or some of it, not all of it, but I felt because we all came from that place, that immediately won me an audience. not just getting it in the mail and just filing it away,
Yeah.
but getting it. And the fact that you had this very arresting cover,
Yes.
brilliant cover, designed by, Mark Mullen, and then with the incredible artwork of Kirabel Testaye, a student who designed the George Floyd imagery. So I felt, if nothing else, it's like, whoa, who
Yeah.
are all these Black people on the cover, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's sort of like, and it wasn't done for any particular statement or shock value, but it made a point. We are Hamilton. So I want to ask you, permit me to toss a question your way.
Sure.
What was your reaction when?
Yeah, no, that's exactly where I was going to go. Is exactly what you're talking about, and the experience. You used the word experience, the experience of the magazine, and I will tell you my experience with it, and I suspect I'm not alone in some of this, and that is, we've become accustomed to getting this thing in the mail, right? And I suspect that I'm not alone in, we get it. Oh, the Hamilton magazine's here. Let me flip to my class notes, right? Let me read about the people I know and then thumb through it. Who's here? Oh, there's an interesting article about this person. Oh, that person wrote a book. Oh, interesting, and then toss it away. Maybe I come back to it every once in a while. And then we hadn't gotten it for a while. Right. So then it shows up in the mail and it's, oh, the Hamilton magazine is back. Let me flip to, oh, what's this? And then it was, whoa. And then you really get into it and then, whoa. Right. And then it was like, oh, this is a different thing than I'm used to. And in a real meaningful way at the absolute right time, I think. And then seeing the reaction on social media from the Hamilton community about it, clearly it resonated. And then just going through it, I mean, there's no doubt it educated many people like me from the community about what the experience, how different the experiences can be, not only at Hamilton, but just in life in general. And one of the things that really stood out to me, and I had it flagged, is in Joshua Bruff's piece, there's the thing about the talk. And I had just come not that long before I got this issue in the mail from a session at work where people were talking about their experiences. And it was one of the first times I had heard a Black colleague talk about the talk. And then I had a conversation with Professor Mark Cryer. He talked about it. And then it's in here. And it's like, wow, this is a real, it's an experience that growing up as a white guy on Long Island, I knew nothing about it and only learned about it very recently. And then to see it keep coming and then even appear in this magazine was really powerful.
Yeah. And I think I remember when we talked about it, when we were developing his essay, which I think is quite brilliant. And one of the reasons I think myself and the team working on the magazine, we felt like it needed to be, and it in and of itself, the introductory essay, because I think he did a brilliant job writing it. But the fact that he posed questions to of the audience, right, of the reader, right, it's sort of like, this is not a magazine that or an article that you are to read, but as you read it, ask yourself the following question. So I thought that was a great way to sort of introduce the dialogue. And also the talk, for me, it was an opportunity to almost put the reader into the shoes of what a young Black man goes through. Mm-hmm. And I think I've said this before, where people think of education. People think, especially in elite education, which I talked about recently with President David Whitman and Dean of Faculty Suzanne Keene, about when we're talking about the value of a liberal arts education, right? That its place and how it's changing. And one of the things we talked about is the ROI, not measured in money necessarily, but in your ability to speak, to think, to write, to hold your own, critical thinking, all of the above. And Hamilton gives all of us these tools, right? Whether you came with them, you certainly leave Hamilton with them. And then you go out in the real world as a professional. And so I knew that sort of stepping back and say, hey, the great equalizer, well, guess what? It's not necessarily equal when it comes to the treatment that you will receive, and this is how far back it goes. So to give the Hamilton reader an ability to say, look at all of our contributors, as you will see, are highly accomplished, and the narrative strain was pretty much the same. And these are people from different class years who didn't know each other, some of whom I didn't know until I put together the magazine. So it was important. And I think the talk was particularly important because you got to kind of see how it happens and what you're told. And many of us have seen the manifestations of that in terms of in the news reports and police stops and what you're supposed to do. And we've seen so many cases where you follow the command and yet and still a routine traffic stop for a busted headlight becomes something that's deadly. So so I'm glad you mentioned that and you saw that. And all absolutely, to me, every essay, I think, offered the ability for reflection and thought. And even if you didn't believe in systemic racism, I think the narrative, it was absolutely almost impossible to argue against the narrative of someone like Nicole Bowman, for example, Bowman Glover, who talked about how her finger was dislocated, or Hamilton trustee Mason Ash, who talked about being bussed and having the N-word hurled or written on his family's car. So I think people may disagree with the prescriptions, the solutions, the origination of the inequality. Is it vestiges of colonialism, racism? Is it not? But what I think you cannot argue against is that these are people who had these particular experiences and they are sharing them.
Yeah. And what I've been happy to see is that it wasn't a one and done sort of special issue from the college, but you've been doing a series of talks as a follow-up to it, which shows, further investment in this education and promoting this dialogue. What have those talks been like for you?
Oh God, it's been fun. It's been really engaging. It's been people have attended, have engaged, and I did one for students, which was particularly gratifying to talk to. This was with the Days Masolo Center, so it was particularly gratifying to be able to talk to students and be part of that as well. And it was important to have a student voices, I should say, in the magazine. I mentioned the cover art and also writers who sort of could be part of this dialogue, because I do think that to the extent that we're able to lend a hand and help in any way we can and stay connected to the students on campus, I think it's important. And so for me, the entire experience, it was important to have that kind of engagement. And the reaction, you mentioned social media, the notes that I have gotten, that some of the writers have gotten from trustees, from former colleagues, from alums I didn't know, others forwarding me the commentary from that's come to the fore. It's been surprising to me, right? Because I'm not used to it in terms of, as a journalist, you only hear the bad news. Like if somebody's calling you about a story, you have messed up, right? So to hear, one comment was that this will be required reading for my grandchildren. This is the most comprehensive body of work I've ever seen put together, in one issue, coming from particularly from a college, and the fact that it came from Hamilton. So I do think it's something that binds us all. And so for me, the issue I'm gratified that it's been received that way, because that's the spirit in which it was conceived from my vantage point. Not to lecture, dictate, but to put it out there, and it's full, it's full truth, and for it to be something that's commemorative, lasting, and becomes part of Hamilton's archives going forward.
And it's going to make it real hard for whoever puts together the next issue. I'll tell you that.
Oh, I'm sure it will be fine.
It's going to be hard to just go back flipping for the class notes. I mean,
but I do want to say this too. I do think what the reaction has shown is that you're right. And when I get my Columbia magazine, and I probably shouldn't say this too loudly, and I am, you kind of put them away and you read them as you get to them,
Yeah.
So, but I think what this has shown is that people want real stories from the alums, right? Not to say that they haven't done real stories, but I think probably it opens the door for, as I mentioned, other students of color to tell their narratives, but overall to all Hamilton students to feel that it's okay to be real. Because one of the comments I got, this was from a trustee who said something to the effect that it was clear the writers were allowed to sort of be open and share and not feel that, there would be some kind of like, dun, dun, dun. So I think that it's important and probably will be something that's that comes out of this.
Yeah, for sure. And you've managed to do something that many have failed to do, which is to prove that print is not dead. That the print medium can still carry.
Although it's interesting, you should mention that, because my career has been as a television journalist.
Right.
Although in terms of another Hamilton college, so one of the journalism experiences I had while I was in Hamilton, I had a gig at the Observer-Dispatch. Do you remember the Observer-Dispatch?
Sure.
And my very illustrious gig was writing short obituaries for Uticans and, people and, yes. So my first journalism gig was writing obituaries. So I used to take the jitney down and go to my gig at the Observer-Dispatch and so and I'm proud to say that so I kind of started in print, sort of.
Yeah.
But my career ended up obviously as a television journalist, and I do think that the hard magazine that you hold in your hand. Obviously, the industry has changed quite a bit, and so much has moved to the digital space. But I do think people want to read meaty content. I do think people want to mix that between the shorthand that we all do. I do the Twitter and the quick headlines that we all need to keep going. I mean, I get up, I have all my alerts on, Apple News, and I kind of, I kind of see what, but at the end of the day, I think people do want the written word. It is not lost. It's not gone. So
sure. And who'd have thunk that as print started to start to decline and have its death toll rung many, many, many times, that someone working in television would also think that medium has completely been disrupted and turned over by digital as well. How has that, do you feel like, impacted the work you've done over the last several years?
Quite a bit. So for me, the route was, I ended up going to graduate school for journalism. And I believe, if I'm recalling some of the stats I remember from my engagement with Hamilton, I believe 40% of Hamilton students go on to an additional degree, med school, law school, and some form of special training beyond the Hamilton degree. And my first choice was English major. And then I really wanted to go to law school. I still consider myself a lawyer in my head. And then journalism school, I ended up going because I was just like, well, I don't know what a journalist is. I kind of sort of do. And I'll go get the degree. If it doesn't work out, I have two other things to fall back on.
Hmm.
And so it's changed quite a bit, the industry now, with so much of the business moving digitally. There's been so much interruption and change. So
Right.
everybody has had to do the great pivot and move the business to digital and learn to be multi-platform, and the same content packaged differently to be consumed differently, depending on whether you're on your computer, you're on mobile, you're, however, you're on television, you're reading it in print. So I think part of that has been the evolution of the business, which has really made journalists to become more nimble and more innovative. And when you think of the communication space, and as somebody who, listen, I was an English major, I'm in love with words. Like, economy of words is nothing that I was used to. And then you become a journalist and you realize the economy of words is really important, because you have to be able to write a 1-minute news package, sometimes a 30-second VO. So, but you realize that there's all these different ways of putting together the news and all these different ways that people want to consume it. So as journalists, I think this has been good. It's transformative. You have now print journalists doing television journalists doing a print, and then you have bloggers. You have it's always been an industry that was quite democratic. So even though I went to grad school for journalism, you don't need a graduate degree to do journalism. Obviously, I'm very proud of the training I got and all that I learned about ethics and all the wonderful things I learned about journalism by going to graduate school. But it's still a profession that if you sort of roll up your sleeves, you put your boots on the ground, you have a scent for news, you can do. And we are seeing that happen in the industry. Now, having said that,
it's kind of a blessing and a curse, because everyone thinks they're a journalist because they got this.
There you go.
They got a camera in their pockets.
Go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Here is the great conundrum, right? Here is the great conundrum where now everybody's a journalist.
Right.
And everybody feels that they can publish, they can tweet, they can make it up as they go along. And so at the end of the day, while I say you don't need additional graduates training, that doesn't mean you don't need to get your butt in a newsroom, learn, listen, and engage and be part of this craft that people have done for as far back as I certainly grew up with a keen awareness of it. So that doesn't mean that you don't have to respect the industry, that you don't have to acknowledge the hard work the journalists do, the importance of true information, the First Amendment, which we're privileged to have in this country. So all these tenets don't go away. So I mean, I may sound a bit preachy, but I do think that that's what's happened as part of the industry. Part of the great technical revolution to the business has also come with this proliferation of false information in and of itself, and also about journalists and what we do.
And you mentioned before attacks on journalists. So 4 years of sowing distrust of journalists as well doesn't help.
And we see that, and we look at, the coverage of journalists in war zones, in my case, some of the work I've done and some of the challenging situations, some of the work, I as a Haitian American, I've covered Haiti, and being in a place particularly who's now, in the news in light of what's happened with the president who's been assassinated.
Yeah.
And when I was there covering the quake as a journalist, but also in this place that I have ties with, and having to find both the professionalism and the humanity at the same time, telling these difficult stories, and journalists putting themselves at harm's way, not for the glory of being heroic, but the sense of these are stories that need to be told. Somebody has to tell them, and get up every day like everybody else with the goal of doing a damn good job. And I think we do. And I think oftentimes that it's not necessarily received that way. But, we soldier on, we do our job, and. so be it.
You mentioned before, and just now again, the notion of the balance between being a journalist and really, frankly, being a human. And I heard you talk to another Hamilton alum, Mike Barlow, and his podcast about journalism, which I will plug now and make sure people want to hear more about your journalism career. They should listen to that and support another Hamilton alum. But I wanted to dig in a little bit on that idea. And for you, there has to be a line, right? But in some cases, when you're covering the quake, the human nature just takes over. And so where is that? Is there a natural break? I'm sure the line moves depending on what's going on, but how do you balance being objective versus being, again, just human?
I think sometimes there are, as a journalist, you learn to, first of all, the story is never about you. And you also learn that when you're in the field, that no matter the story that you're covering, it could be a small business and they just opened, or some big political story or natural disaster or something, that you're the vehicle that somebody is communicating their story, right? It's your story in the sense that you're putting it together, but it's their story in the sense that they have given you the privilege of talking to you, and you want to be responsible about it. So in terms of where the line is, it's sometimes very hard to be dispassionate. And what I mean by you have feelings. You're a person, right? You're a human being, so you understand the challenges or the celebratory nature of whatever interview you're doing. And in the case of the quake, I was there for almost a month and got there, within 24 hours of when it happened in 2010. And so, and you go there, you've got your journalist mind, but the more you are there, the more you realize that, wow, you are part of the story in a way you may not even know. One example, I remember I was doing a story. We were at a church, and it was the first Sunday service since the quake. So people, for the first Sunday, they're going to mass, they're going to service. We get to this church, and there's a woman, an elderly woman in her 70s, I believe. She was seated sort of on the steps. She had sort of like two plastic bags. And so we were setting up for a live shot. And then you see this woman there, right? What are you going to, it's the natural thing you would do. It's the same way you're helping a little lady cross the street. So I went over to her and I basically said, why are you here? Right. And she basically said that the shelter, the elderly home where she was staying had collapsed. And so she came to, the people were taking care of them, weren't around, people had fled and escaped. And she took refuge at the steps of this church. Long story short, she had the business card of her son who worked at a photo shop in Miami. And I said, I'm going to take the card. And she asked me to call her son. And I think she found a place to be, so I called her son. Who didn't know if his mom was alive. And they came, two of them, to rescue her. We ended up interviewing them. The reunion later, they were American citizens. And I believe the mother was too, I'm not sure. We got them at the embassy trying to make their way out in the quake zone. So you can't be there and I'm just doing my job, right? And not turn to say to anybody. And you've seen it, whether it's you're looking at the protest, you're looking at the rescue mission going on right now in Florida and Surfside. You're not going to cover that and not feel like this is horrific, that these people were sleeping and then the building collapsed. In the same way, that when you get the call or when I got the call of what had happened in Haiti, it's like you're jolted. Your journalist mind is like, wow, this is a big deal. But, your human mind, you realize this is horrific. It's a tragedy. The country's in mourning. This this commando style operation that happened and what it all means. So all of that. So I think, and I think journalists, we all have that in us, because I don't know how you do this job if you don't have that purpose and that sense of humanity. And even, I will say this, even in cases where journalists have just sort of been outright horrific in their slant and how they cover something, or vitriol, I think they know. I think they know. I think they know. And I think, you know, people may choose to sort of look at it dispassionately, but I think that at the core of it, at least for me, that's why I went into the business.
And for those that listening who are interested to get in the business, I'm sure students reach out to you asking for advice. What advice do you have for Hamilton students looking to get into your line of work?
Right. You know, I mean,
even if it's obituaries,
because, you know, I'll say this, I probably learned from writing the obituaries about, you know, that sensibility. Everybody has a story, right? You may be writing like this 200 word obituary about so-and-so died and they lived and the kids and they were, so maybe that's where I first developed my you know, that sense of humanity. But I do think that Hamilton does prepare you, even though you learn about all these things that don't seem to sort of come together, tie together, but that you are being formed. So I think intellectual curiosity, writing, the ability to have an expansive mind. I do think, you know, in my junior year, part of my junior year, I lived in Spain with a Spanish family. So having an intellectual curiosity, not being myopic about people all over the world, I think it's very important for people to do. And what you read, diverse content, read about things that you may not even think you should read about. So I think that is the base, the formation of being a journalist. And because one day you could be in a tent city interviewing somebody who's homeless, and the next day you could be at the White House, you know, something's happening in the Oval Office or the press briefing room, or you're abroad, there's like this big summit. So you unless you have that ability to be curious, to want to know. So the first thing is be curious, read a lot, learn a lot, be a sponge. And also, I think the second thing is to know what's a story, right? What's a story? A story is, you know, it can take on different forms, but depending on if it's a news story, first of all, it's got to be news. It's got to be relevant. It's got to be now. It's got to be something that shapes the dialogue. And then more long form, different types of journalism. There are things that are more investigative, that inquire more thorough research, more fact finding. You need to talk to a lot of stakeholders. You need to get documents. You need to do the legwork. So really, I think anybody who's dogged, anybody who's curious, anybody who has an expansive mind or wants to develop that, I think, so those are some of the things I tell future journalists to look for in themselves.
How much in that searching for what makes a story does, in the line of work that you've predominantly worked in, does the notion of, is it going to command an audience and drive ratings play a factor?
So it's really kind of like the chicken and the egg, right? In terms of, I mean, there are stories that you have to cover, right? Whether they're boring, whether nobody will watch them, particularly at the local news level, you still have to tell people what's going on in their communities. You still have to tell people what the weather is going to be, what the traffic is, right? So at the basic of providing information, even though people have different ways of getting it now, you put on your Google app and you see where the traffic zone is, and you sort of, people have access to the information, the weather, you know, Siri can tell you anything you want to know. But so I think at the basic level, you have to offer that information. And I think more looking at it more widely, I do think that there is that sense that the information needs to be expansive, and that it needs to be something that people can connect to, and that it is from a trusted source. Because we just did kind of talk about everybody thinks they're a journalist, and knowing what your trusted source of information is. And even that in and of itself can be challenging. Knowing what's a first source, a secondary source, a tertiary source. I mean, it's sort of like not word on the street, right? Or so-and-so said. So it's that ability to really, and I do think that, while Hamilton doesn't, have a course in journalism, and many of these things I learned in, journalism school and practicing the craft, I do think that for the most part, the audience that I'm talking to, even as students, I think would have a natural proclivity to want to dig deeper, at least from what I remember about
Right. So thinking about your Hamilton experience, and back to you arriving on that beautiful day for Multicultural Student Weekend, anything you wish you had known?
Wow. What I wish I'd known is that I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. And I think, like any sort of cocky, know they're smart, think they're smart, 18-year-old going to college with all the enthusiasm of what that would mean and look like. I kind of thought I knew it all, but we probably all did. So did you,
sure,
right?
Of course.
And so,
did you feel that come through in the archives you were digging up when you were looking at those blue books? And
okay, I have to tell you, I'm going to say this to you. I did, right? Here's why, right? And this may be a bit long of an answer. So one of the things I discovered, and I think in my essay I made reference to John Milton's Paradise Lost. I discovered a paper that I had written about the rape of sin and death, the circular motion of the rape of sin and death. And it was all this sort of like who wrote this? Like, I was just like, wow, was I ever that smart? Like I don't even think you couldn't pay me to write anything like that, right? I was like way beyond, so that absolutely surprised me, the sort of esoteric nature of some of the stuff that I wrote, that even I was like, what? But having said that, I do think to kind of go back to the essay, in terms of looking at, Black people, the experiences of people of color. And at the time, how because the numbers were few, we sort of forged this bond while there. And then everybody kind of went their separate ways. Some of us stuck together. I still have some very, very wonderful friends. Some of my best friends are from my days at Hamilton. But at the same time, I do think that that understanding that we are the Black diaspora, right? And that sense of, you've got African Americans, you've got Afro-Caribbeans, people from the continent of Africa, Latin America. So this sort of like this body of, and as you saw, the voices, we had people from, there were voices from all over. And so for me, I think I wish I'd better understood that sense that I came to understand later. And then as I discovered that, in my career, this collective voice that we have that can even be a more powerful voice for some of the changes that we're trying to make.
All right, that's Edvige Jean-François, class of 1990, and the guest editor and driving force behind the We Are Hamilton special edition of Hamilton magazine. If you haven't read that magazine yet, I don't know what the heck is wrong with you. There'll be a link in the show notes, or you can go to hamilton.edu/magazine, and it'll take you to the special issue. It's something you got to check out. My thanks to Edvige for joining this week. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I'm going to brag for a minute because both setting up this conversation and some notes that we exchange after the conversation, Edvige had paid me some compliments about my interviewing skills. And to come from an award-winning journalist, producer like that, it's high praise. So I was very flattered. You have been listening to Had I Known on WHCL-FM, Clinton, New York. Had I Known.buzzsprout.com. Had I Known Show on social media. As always, my thanks to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying the music on this show. And once again, Doc is going to play us out. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll talk to you next week.
Had I Known podcast show on your radio or take it to go.